Welcome. I'm glad you're joining me to learn about how to make translucent jewelry with my acrylic forms. I'm using the medium square here and some magic gloss. And I'm also working with different inclusions from my product line. The tiny tats you see here are from the micro inclusion mini set, but you can also use the larger ones from the regular set seen here. I've cherry-picked some watch parts out of a half-ounce package of the Steampunk watch part collection. These are micro charms and coins available in individual sets or as a part of the micro inclusion mini kit. And I'm going to work with some dried flowers with the dried flower wheel here. I've got fine tip tweezers. And for your acrylic form, you should always cure it on some type of cure surface like this small piece of glass here with a piece of scrap clay on it. You can also use a small bathroom tile or a craft mirror. There's some other items you might want optionally to work with. I've got some glitter here, and for coloring some of the tiny tats, I'll use permanent markers. Now I'm working with this mini strip that comes with the micro inclusions kit, and it has a protective film. You see me peeling it off. That film is not on the regular tiny tat or other transfer sets. So I'm going to select the butterfly and using permanent markers. It's very important that any markers you use if you color your tiny tats is permanent. It should say so on the marker. So I'm going to start with a little bit of yellow on the bottom part of the wing. Get that colored in. And then I'm going to go to orange, just right in the middle here. And then finish off with a red right at the top tip of the butterfly's wings. Now when you cut these out, it's not really important that it's right exactly along the edge. In fact, you'll find it's pretty impossible to cut it exactly up to the edge, especially on some of the floral and other shaped tiny tats. Just close enough is good enough. And if you just let it sit for a minute or two before you work with it, that should be enough time to let the ink dry permanently to the tiny tat film. Now these acrylic pieces, whatever shape or size, come with a clear plastic protective coating you have to remove. And you just remove one side to begin with, and you remove the other side later, either when you're finished or if you're going to work on the opposite end. Now you can use a number of tools like the tip of your tweezers, the edge of a craft knife, or your fingernails. And be very careful as you do this. You don't want to scratch the plastic underneath. Fingernails are best for that purpose, but if you don't have any nails, very carefully try to get underneath the plastic film with the tip of tweezers or an X-Acto type craft knife and just peel off that one side to start. Now it's important to work on a cure surface and place it on some scrap polymer clay, and let's talk about why these are important. First of all, that's going to hold it securely to your work surface, whether it's a tile, a mirror, or this small piece of glass that I have here. One thing you don't want to have happen is to work on a cure surface, and as you're carrying it to the sun or to your UV light, you don't want your piece, whether it's acrylic or a bezel form, whatever, to slide off. Plus, putting it on a piece of scrap clay enables it to hold your piece nice and level, straight up and down. Say if you were working with one of my ring bezels, obviously that's not going to lay flat on a cure surface, so the clay, the scrap clay, will help hold it in place, just like it does here for this acrylic form. It's a good thing to use for anything you're going to use the resin on. Now here, we're looking at the edges. It's important that the scrap clay is smaller than whatever you set it on, for the reason that if you add too much, you want it to overflow and go underneath the edges of your piece to make it easy to clean up. But if it's gonna stick, out on top from beneath your plastic, it can spread out all over and flood the surface of the clay, and it will pool the resin rather than draw it underneath. The other reason is working on a cure surface like this allows you to rotate as you spread the resin, making sure you've reached every corner and every edge. All very important things. Now when we're going to add our first layer of magic gloss, I always work with it adding from the center of whatever I'm creating. And you start with less than you think you need. but you can always add more. Here I'm only adding a tiny little bit to act as glue. This is going to lock in my first inclusions. I'm selecting some steampunk components or vintage watch parts from my micro inclusion collection. Now when you design, it's important not to go too crazy adding inclusions for your first layer unless one layer is all you want. And I usually add the more dimensional pieces in the first layer. They're easier to cover when you're doing layered pieces like this. What you see here is some scrap clay that I'm going to use as a support because I'm using some of those watch parts as suspension or connection methods. You can use them as a bracelet or for a pendant. And the nice thing is the magic gloss acts as a glue in this first layer. That little bit I smeared on will lock the pieces in place. They don't cover or coat the pieces, and you don't want that because they can migrate all over. And it's good to have a gap here between the layers of scrap clay and the acrylic piece. That way magic gloss can't migrate over between the two, and that helps support those pieces so that they sit exactly at the angle you want them to be. Now, I don't always know what pieces I want. Sometimes I put pieces in and remove them, but I usually start with 3 or 4 dimensional pieces for my first layer, and I try to stay away from the edges because they're a little harder to cover at that point, but you can always file down anything that sticks out or trim it up with scissors if it's an image transfer. So just taking a couple of my charms, and as you see here, I'm kind of trying to figure this out as I go along. I don't always have a clear idea of how I'm designing my pieces when I begin them, which is half the fun. If a piece doesn't look right where you want it, it's easy enough to move around. You have pretty much indefinite working time with the magic gloss until you expose it to long wave UV light and set it to cure. Get your pieces positioned as you like them, and then they're going to be locked into place in just a few minutes. It's time to transfer your piece into a long wave UV light source, like my UV curing lamp you see here. Magic gloss cures great in direct sunlight. That means outdoors, not in your windowsill. But this adds added convenience so that you can transfer right at your workstation. Plus, it's great for the days that are cloudy, rainy, and of course, windy days where you don't want any surprise inclusions. Now in our initial layers, we only need to cure 3 or 4 minutes, just enough to set the magic gloss. And this will lock inclusions into place or build up our canvas layers, which we'll see in a bit. But even though it still might be tacky, it's okay to continue building and building until we get to our last layer. After a few minutes in the light, you can check, make sure everything's locked into place. So far, so good. And adding our next layer of magic gloss, which is a canvas layer. This should be thick enough to create some flat surface areas to add another layer of inclusions, but it's not important that you cover all the raised dimensional elements that are on your piece. Now you see that all-important rotation. I can remove that scrap clay now because the top and bottom suspension pieces are locked into place, and continue to rotate, pulling it out to each edge. Now, one of the things that we often hear about, people get a little frustrated that on open-sided pieces of clay or something like this, the magic gloss may not stay right on the edges. And here it's okay to add a little bit more if you find you need more to spread it around. That is addressed in the instructions, and it's a very easy fix. It usually takes 2 to 3 thin layers, curing between each layer, before it will stay all the way to the outer edges of something that doesn't have a bezel wall to hold the resin in place. So it's just important to get a thin layer here, some flat areas to work with after we give it another cure. Just take your time spreading it around. That's really important. That key I found is a little bit loose. That's okay. That didn't get locked in. That tells me I didn't have enough magic gloss smeared underneath, but that's okay. I'll just make sure that it's back where I want it to be located so that it gets locked into place on the second time under the light. And just bring it up along or near the edges. Don't worry about if it pulls back a bit, that's normal. Adding subsequent layers as we go is going to address that. Now, air bubbles are a problem if people tend to shake their magic gloss. That's not necessary. It doesn't need any shaking or stirring, but in dimensional areas right there, I was pointing out, those are possible places for air pockets to form. So I'm getting a little torch. I'm moving everything out of the way that can be flammable. And air pockets, as long as they rise to the top, they'll pop by themselves over time. Or with a butane torch, this is very hot. This is hot enough to melt metal, so I'm turning it on with extreme care, making sure it's not pointed at anything flammable. And we're going to move the magic gloss out of the way. Let's talk a little bit about the torch. So once it goes on, it's a little bright. It's hard to see, but that little sharp pointed blue tip is actually blue in dim light. That's the hottest part of the flame. We're going to pass this over the magic gloss, and any bubbles that are on or near the surface will pop instantly. Now we're out of the light and it's already nice and hard, and it's not even tacky at this point. Just 3 or 4 minutes was all it took. And it's a little mottled looking, and I've got some dimensional pieces coming back up through the first layer of resin that we added after our glue layer. And we're going to prepare another glue layer. A few drops working in the middle. And I usually don't use a brush. I'll spread it with my fingertip because I can clean it with a baby wipe. And then once you're done working with the resin, be sure to wash your hands thoroughly with soap and water before you handle any food products. You want enough that it's going to give a thin coating to the surface, but not so much that your pieces can migrate around. Now we're going to go back to this image transfer we colored earlier. What I'm doing is taking a few drops of water. That's what's going to release the translucent transfer from the paper backing. And you want to let it sit about 30 to 60 seconds. Generally 60 seconds is a little bit better. And how about some dried flowers? When you don't use it, you can keep them all from falling out by having that opening just positioned over that closed cavity. Now I'm dialing the opening to the color flower I want, and what I just did there is picked up a little bit of magic gloss on the end of my tweezers. Again, using it like a glue. It allows me to grab small objects so that I can easily position them onto that glue layer. Very gently pressing it down. I don't want to tear the flower, but make sure that I'm pushing so that it forces any air that might have been trapped between the flower and the resin out. And you might even see it darkening a bit, and that's okay. It's all going to pop and be very vibrant by the time we're finished with this whole thing. So now I think it's almost time. Why don't we head on back to that image transfer, have a piece of dry paper toweling or some tissue like I have here, and blot off moisture from the front and the back. That's equally important. Be very careful. These are a very delicate thin film. And you want to slide the transfer off almost completely off the backing, not all the way, and very carefully lift it. Don't pull. Removing the paper backing and positioning the transfer wherever you like. Also making sure you press down to push any air bubbles that may occur between the two layers out. Now you see here it's really dark. Don't worry about that. It's going to be nice and bright and pop. What you're seeing through that translucent film is that dark scrap clay that's in the background. We're going to talk about ways to kind of prevent that from happening later on. Back to the flower wheel. I'm going to pick up a little resin on the end of my tweezers and pick up a flower that's got a bit more contrast to that red one we first started with, and position that into that glue layer. And I think I want to go ahead and I've got a lot of negative space I left, so I'm going to add a couple more transfers. And I'm going to cut out a couple of these leaf transfers. I would have colored them in advance if I wanted to have a tint, but I'm going to use them in the black and white. Again, cutting close, but it doesn't have to be exact. When I work with my transfers, not just the tiny tats, but the pre-printed transfers or even the do-it-yourself ones I make with my specialty inkjet water paper, I sometimes only use sections, edges or corners of my transfers and have them come in from a corner and edge of whatever I'm creating, and don't use necessarily the entire transfer. Back to our water and getting a few drops on there and letting it soak. You can even pick them up with your tweezers and dip them in there. But let it sit on there for a little bit. The smaller transfers only usually take about 30 seconds to release. If it's a bigger transfer, I'd give it more time before I blot off the excess moisture and try to remove that. Another thing you can do is let your transfers, after you apply them, they can actually be sticking out over the edge. You can find after you cure it that you can clean up that edge with an emery board or a little bit of a filing action, and blotting the water. And let's get some of that extra water out of the way. Be sure you, when you're not working with your transfers, you set them aside where it's nice and dry so they can't get damaged or released prematurely from the backing. Now, I flip that over because it doesn't matter. There's no real front or back to these transfers. Even the ones you color, if you want to flip it over because it positions better into a spot, that's okay, because the color and the outline is going to be equally visible from either side. Okay, last little leaf here, and this is when you do your design, this is where it's good that you leave a little open negative space so you continue to have options of positioning things. It's okay too to layer your components as you go. And I picked up a little bit more magic gloss and end of my tweezers. That wasn't enough, so let's get some more. And I start placing my steampunk watch parts in some of the other places. Again, I'll probably end up overlapping a few. These are the small ones, so they tend to be nice and flat and don't have a lot of dimensional quality. So they're going to be very easy to cover with our final layer and get a nice rounded glass-like cabochon effect on the surface. I'm adding the last and final layer, curing for at least 10 minutes, but any drilling or manipulation you might do should wait for at least an hour after you've taken it out of the light. Once your piece is finished on the front, you want to remove that protective layer on the back, being careful once again not to scratch it. I'm just lifting up the edges. Now, sometimes after I get that off, I just leave the piece exactly the way it is, and I'm finished. I'm ready to connect it to some chain or suspend it in any way I desire. Look how great that came out. But other times you might want to add more layers on the back and build them up so you have a rounded effect. You see here I'm running my fingers back through there, so you see how it changes the tonality of what the piece looks like. So you want to decide if you want to fill that in, create a background, something that won't compete. But here I'm taking a scrap piece of paper that's a darker beige, and you can see how it changes the tonality completely of the piece. So if you are going to add layers on the back and put inclusions or some type of background that's compatible with magic gloss, you want something that won't compete with the inclusions and the pattern you have. So here I'm taking this translucent iridescent glitter and I'm putting it out, but don't add the magic gloss right on top like it looked like I was about to do. I put it right next to the side because you'll find the glitter just gets airborne and goes everywhere. With your toothpick or a needle tool, I like a needle tool because I can wipe it up with a baby wipe and I'm not throwing away material. But you're just going to stir it until it's a nice uniform consistency. If you think it's too thick, by all means, add a little bit more magic gloss. And if you don't think it's thick enough, then add more glitter till you get the consistency that you're looking for. But just mix it all in together quite well. Then you're going to reattach your piece face down on your cure surface and your scrap clay and add the glitter mixture to the background and spread it around. If you need to make more glitter, go ahead and mix some up on your scrap paper. I'm checking to make sure it's level, spreading it out. You'll find that adding inclusions thickens the magic gloss, so it won't spread quite as easily, and it'll hold a nice thick bead. So you can always go back and add some more, mix different colors into it, just play around and have a lot of fun. Bring it all the way up to the edges. Usually air bubbles don't occur when I'm mixing inclusions in there, but you may go ahead and give it a little flash with forced heat before you cure it anyway. I didn't show you the last layer I added to give it a smooth glass cabochon effect, but you can leave the texture of the glitter the way it is with just that last layer we did. So there we have it. All of the dimensional quality, the color, everything just pops, and you can see the depth. And now we're just going to clean this up. Just take care of your magic gloss the way you might clean a piece of glass. Only magic gloss is much more durable. This is an alcohol swab to wipe off any fingerprints or residue from our scrap clay, or you can just use a damp cloth or paper towel, or even glass cleaner on it. I went ahead and made some dangles out of Swarovski crystal elements ahead of time. All I need to do is add them in place on that bottom steampunk component that I left sticking out beyond the edges of the acrylic form. I'm just going to take some jewelry pliers here, close it up so everything's nice and secure, and I'm going to add the smaller dangles on either side of this to give it a nice balance. There's a harmony in the number 3, so you'll often see 3 attachments or 3 dangles in a lot of the pieces that I do. So last one, and now we're ready to suspend it from a chain or a cord, and we'll take a better look at this piece in the gallery section that follows. Here's our finished piece, and doesn't it look fabulous? I hope you'll enjoy making these as much as I do, but let's take a look at a few other pieces, like one that had a polymer clay edge baked around it before it was filled in with resin and steampunk parts. These can curl slightly when baking, so keep that in mind. Here's foil scraps layered on an oval acrylic form. Mica flakes and dried flowers were layered on the oval piece, and the crystal was set in the center about an hour after curing. I drilled holes in this piece and inserted rivets to create a cold connection look. This also has a glitter background. Here's another translucent collage made with many different elements, including tiny tats, micro steampunk parts, and even foils. I used the smallest form to make one of these fun little tiles with a fiber glitter background, and I used decorative jump rings for the suspension and dangle loops. I set snippets of foil in a layer of magic gloss and finished with a second layer. An hour after curing, holes were drilled along the edge, and a wire coil was threaded through the holes, and finally flat back crystals were glued in place. Lastly, and for another cold connected effect, I drilled holes in the corners of this finished piece and added micro hardware, screws, and hex nuts from my micro inclusion line. Thanks so much for joining me. For more tips, techniques, tutorials, where I might be teaching in the world, or for more information on products seen here like magic gloss, the acrylic forms, micro inclusions, and much more, please visit my website www.lisapavelka.com.